Zoning Board of Adjustment of November 9th, 2022. The Zoning Board of Adjustment is a quasi-judicial board created by the City of Ames. The board's purpose is to decide on applications for home occupation permits, special use permits, exceptions and variances to the zoning ordinance, applications for conditional use permits in the floodplain, requests for reasonable accommodation because of a handicap, and appeals of the decisions of the zoning enforcement officer. As a board of the city, we welcome all testimony. We make our decisions based on the facts and evidence as allowed under city code and presented in open meeting. Testimony before the board must be given under oath or affirmation. If the proceedings become lengthy, we may ask that testimony be focused on new facts or evidence not already presented. We ask that you come to the microphone if you wish to speak so that your testimony will be audible and may be recorded. Before speaking, please complete an orange information card and hand it to the recording secretary. The orange information cards are right outside of the door, and our recording secretary is right here. When you are testifying, please address your remarks to the board. We also ask that the proceedings be orderly. The Zoning Board of Adjustment is an independent volunteer board of citizens. We are not part of the city administration. We are served in our efforts by Jane Chang, Assistant City Attorney, Eloise Sahlstrom and Ray Anderson, City Planners. Oh, and who am I missing? Kelly Diekman, Planning and Housing Director, and Natalie Reckemeyer, Recording Secretary. The order of proceedings for each application will be as follows. First, an oral statement summarizing the issues and procedural steps will be presented by the staff. Second, testimony and evidence will be presented by the applicant. Third, testimony may be heard from any members of the audience who wish to speak in support of or in opposition to the appeal. Next, the board will give the applicant and the city staff an opportunity to present concluding summaries and arguments. And finally, the board will discuss the issues and evidence and come to a decision. Now, the first item of the agenda is the approval of meeting minutes. We can start with the meeting minutes of July 13th, 2022. Are there any additions, corrections?
Move approval.
I'll second.
That's an approval by Bowers, a second by Patton. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Minutes are approved. The second is approval of the meeting minutes of October 26th, 2022.
I move that we approve the minutes.
Second.
That is an approval by Schneider, a second by Bowers. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Minutes are approved. The next item on the agenda is a request for an appeal of 802 Burnett Avenue, parcel number 0902325100, from a decision of the zoning enforcement officer regarding encroachment of a structure within the front yard.
Good evening. On the screen is an aerial of the location. The subject property is located at the corner of 8th Street and Burnett Avenue in the Old Town Historic District. The request is an appeal of a decision of the planning director regarding a proposed fence in the rear yard that classifies the entire structure as fence. The planning director's decision is that a proposed structure located along the rear property line is the fence, as defined in section 29.20174. As a fence, the structure is limited in its height and location on a property. The appellate's proposed fence exceeds the maximum height of 6 feet for fences in the rear yard setback for posts utilized in the design of the fence. The appellate asserts that the extended posts are not part of a fence, but instead landscape accents, which would then exempt them from height limits. The property is occupied by a single-family dwelling and attached garage, and has non-conforming side and rear building setbacks. However, fences may be constructed without regard to the required building setback as long as the height of the fence meets the height limitations described in the zoning ordinance. Properties in Old Town Historic District are required to receive a certificate of appropriateness for certain improvements, including fencing. The zoning ordinance defines a fence as an unroofed barrier or enclosing structure. Fences in the Old Town Historic District are required to comply with the height standards in the zoning ordinance. In this instance, the height limit is 6 feet in a rear yard setback. The appellate's proposed structure includes a 3-foot brick wall with 3 brick columns that are proposed to extend to a height of 6 foot 6 inches for the columns. The brick columns surround support posts that extend to 12 feet. That would be this dimension here, with arms that extend outward 8 feet, resulting in a total height over 12 feet. The extended features are to be built into the brick wall and located along with the hip wall 1 foot from the property line. The 12-foot extensions are physically part of the fence design and were determined to be subject to the fence height limitations. This went to the Historic Preservation Commission this summer, and they referred the request back to staff or to the applicant for additional information. And based on staff's interpretation that it was a fence, it wasn't able to be approved by them for a certificate of appropriateness. On September 15th, staff met with the applicant and explained the next steps. One of the options described to the applicant was to appeal the decision of the planning director. And that's what they've chosen to do in bringing this item forward tonight. The zoning ordinance applies setback and other development regulations to all structures. I'm sorry, that is not, I've kind of zoomed in too much. That shows you 3 different views of the proposed structure in the rear yard. The structure this structure is the front porch that's attached to the house. The structure in the rear yard is not attached to the house. It's freestanding. It's only attached to the wall as part of the fence. Structures include the full array of elements and features associated with its construction. Projections and exceptions are specifically called out when applicable. The ordinance also allows for exceptions to setbacks for certain features. In this situation, staff determined that a proposed structure was classified in its entirety as a fence, and that as a fence, it does not meet the allowable fence height for being in a rear yard setback. Additionally, as discussed with the appellant's appeal, if the structure is determined to not be a fence and is a landscape accent, it is still subject to fence limitations due to the design and configuration of the structure. There's a definition in your handout about for structure from the zoning ordinance. And basically, the zoning ordinance considers essentially all constructed improvements above ground to be structures. The structure varies in height between 6 and 12 feet. There's a definition of fence. Fence means an unroofed barrier or unroofed enclosing structure, including retaining walls. Staff finds that the structure is a barrier enclosing an area. The structure is proposed to be located 1 foot from the rear property line, defining the property boundary and enclosing the patio space on one side. All individual components of the structure together comprise the structure. The extended features are to be built into the brick wall. This is proposed, it's not built yet. The appellant has indicated that the intent of the extended features is to create a sense of place. As currently designed, the extended piers, posts, and arms are integral to the proposed structure, both visually and structurally, in creating a boundary. The entire structure, along with extended features, define the property edge and create enclosure, meeting the definition of a fence. The zoning ordinance requires all structures to meet setbacks. The ordinance does provide for certain exceptions by allowing specific projections into the setbacks as listed in the zoning ordinance. At issue in this appeal is section 29.402, parentheses 2, which gives a list of permissible projections, minor projections, architectural projections, and full projections. The highlighted section in your report is the full projections that are allowed. And as such, fences are allowed within a setback. Landscape accents are also allowed when they meet the information there that says landscape accents that include but are not limited to arbors with a coverage area no greater than 15 square feet, fountains and statuary up to 4 feet in height, and constructed ponds and waterfalls at or below finished grade, and similar incidental landscape accents. The design and location of accent features shall not have the effect of creating a continuous wall that does not meet fence standards. The appellate has requested that the extended piers, posts, and arms be classified as landscape features or landscape accents. However, as currently designed, the fence is one structure comprised of components that visually and structurally form the fence. For the extended features to be considered landscape accents, they would have to be disconnected from the other components of the fence as a separate and detached structure. Staff has conveyed this to the appellant. The proposed fence height varies from 3 feet to greater than 12 foot, as already mentioned, so it does not meet the maximum fence height of 6 feet. It's the recommendation of the Department of Planning and Housing that the Zoning Board of Adjustment uphold the decision of the planning director that the classification of the proposed structure as fence is correct, and therefore the height of the proposed structure must therefore meet the height restrictions of a fence as outlined in the zoning ordinance. The appellate's ability to appeal a decision of the planning director is given in the zoning ordinance. In this case, the appellate believes the planning director has incorrectly interpreted the zoning ordinance by determining the proposed structure to be a fence that's regulated in the zoning ordinance. The appellate is appealing the interpretation by the planning director, classifying the proposed structure in its entirety as a fence. The appellate asserts that the tall parts, extended piers, posts, and arms of the structure are not part of the fence and should be classified as landscape features, landscape accents. He states, although they touch walls, they do not include lines of sight or movement in the way a fence would, and certainly not in a way which would represent a danger given their shape and location. However, the appellate also states, although I agree that we in this design and choice of materials have tried to make these vertical features part of a harmonious whole, they are not in themselves what one would consider a fence, nor do they further the purposes of a fence, regardless of what objects they touch. The Zoning Board of Adjustment is authorized to consider an appeal of an administrative decision based on Code of Iowa to determine if there was an error. The appeal process is not an exception or variance process. It is an interpretation of zoning standards that apply uniformly across the city. The Zoning Board of Adjustment must determine that there was an error in the interpretation by the planning director, that the entire structure, including the extended piers, posts, and arms proposed at 802 Burnett Avenue is a fence per the zoning ordinance. That's the incorrect reference there. I was referencing chapter 31. At issue is not the appropriateness or adequacy of the standards, but only if staff made an incorrect interpretation. The appellate asserts that the extended features are a landscape feature or accent under the zoning ordinance, and that the purpose of the structure is to create a sense of place. Staff does not believe the purpose of the design supersedes its actual physical characteristic. As it is currently designed, the extended piers, posts, and arms are integral to the proposed structure, both visually and structurally. All of the components of the structure together comprise the enclosure or fence. The entire structure, along with the extended features, help define the property edge and create enclosure, meeting the definition of a fence. There's no precedent to exclude parts of a structure from the interpretation of the standards that apply to the overall structure unless expressly authorized by the zoning ordinance. For example, eaves may encroach partially into a setbacks as stated in the code. They are not excluded from being part of the structure in order to allow for them to not meet a setback standard. For the extended features to be classified as a landscape accent, they would need to be redesigned as a separate structurally sound detached structure and not serve as an enclosure or boundary. Therefore, it is the recommendation of the planning director that the zoning board of adjustment approve alternative 1, which is to find that the planning director correctly interpreted the Ames Municipal Code, that the proposed structure at 802 Burnett Avenue is a fence and subject to the maximum fence height standards. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Does the board have any questions for staff at this moment?
What are the what are the requirements for a trellis? If I were to build a deck or a patio and put a trellis over it, what are the requirements for that?
The only requirements we have are the ones listed that are highlighted in
the
your,
land.
under full projections allowed landscape accents.
So then
That
trellis,
paragraph would have to meet
You're
that.
talking about something that's attached to a house.
right? I'm
Or-
asking
So-
about a trellis.
So,
I have a
Or
deck
freestanding.
that has
so there's a lot of
Goes-
versions of that in our
Oh.
world. So
right, but normally you have a deck
talking
and then
about
it
vertical.
goes vertical and then has horizontal slats that connect to the house. It's a trellis.
So once it's attached to the house, it's part of the primary structure. It is not an accessory structure. So
That's
we
what I'm
would-
asking.
We would treat it as a house. All parts of it would have to be height and setback requirements.
Okay.
Once
and
it's
then
attached to the house. So it's freestanding. That's when you're getting into some of these other allowances
That-
that we have.
that would be more like an arbor, which would be freestanding, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm defining terms.
Yeah. So anything that's attached to that principal structure, it's all part of that principal structure. Even if it's an add-on later
So-
on, if it's attached by one beam, it's part of that principal structure.
So if those beams that come up were actually to attach to the structure on the other side, which they don't, if they were to attach them, would they be considered a part of the structure?
Yes,
Then is there any issue with the setback at that point?
there's a large issue with it.
Yeah.
Because
there
they're
are
too
any
close to the
setbacks.
line.
Yeah.
Yes. that
because
would
you-
be too-
6 feet, right? Or what is
the
the
rear yard, right?
rear
Yes,
yard?
the rear yard, and they already have a non-conforming rear setback.
Okay, so
They
the-
don't meet the setback.
what's the
already.
setback on the
20.
20 on the rear yard? And then this is obviously within that.
This is 1 foot from the rear
Yeah, that's what-
setback.
okay, 1
So
foot.
they can have the fence, but the fence has to be up to
or
6
less.
feet.
6 feet or less.
They can have a fence,
A fence up to 6 feet.
right?
You can have as many fences as you want,
Of course.
as long as they're 6 feet or
You
less.
put it on the line if you want to.
Yes.
Or,
You could have 3 fences, but
okay. But then so then this isn't freestanding because it's connected to the retaining wall.
which is a fence.
And it doesn't serve the purpose as a trellis because it's not connected to the house. And it's not an arbor because it's not freestanding.
Because it's attached to the fence. It's part of the fence.
Well, it's a retaining wall, but anyway.
So they're the same in the zoning ordinance.
Okay,
A wall and a fence are the same thing.
gotcha. And so then it extends above the limit, which is 6 feet.
Right.
I'm just getting all the,
And if it were freestanding in between the house and the fence, what does that arbor need to be in terms of a setback? Does it have to have a setback?
Yeah, so everything has some version of a setback except for fences can be on a property line. There's a few
Mhm.
things
But
like
if it was
that.
freestanding, it would be
So
an
the-
arbor, as long
Okay.
as it doesn't cover more than 15 square feet.
Right. So the arbors is a traditional little arch that's like
Right.
over
Right,
a
right,
walkway, and
I mean,
it's-
this is a different take on it, and I see where, you know.
Yeah, so I'm trying, yeah, yes.
So if you're, yeah. So then there's three. Let's step back for a second. So all structures are subject to all standards in the code, right? And
Mhm.
that's the basic premise of the zoning ordinance. Principal structures, which is the house, we're applying standard front yard setbacks, rear setbacks, lot coverage, all of those things. And then if you have a structure that's detached from the house, we have a list of when those are allowed to be in setbacks. And there's a variety of things that they could be. We also allow for detached accessory buildings to have, in some cases, different setbacks than the main house as well. So it depends on if you're the principal structure, an accessory building, or some other type of structure, which layer of setbacks apply to you. So I think that's kind of answering your series of questions, Chad, on if it's not this, then what would it be?
Right.
There's different rules depending on what category you're in.
Yeah.
But anything that's attached to the principal must meet all setbacks.
Because my thought initially looking at it, and I, think out loud all the time anyway, was like, that's a trellis or an arbor. It's not a fence, but it does. I see where it fits within that. I do also notice on this property that the garage is like across the line, probably, which isn't unusual in Ames. When they built a lot of buildings, they just built it and then figured out where the line was later. It's probably been that way since the house was built.
But that would be like.
Well, it can be
grandfathered in.
non-conforming, they just can't make changes. But you mentioned that it's non-conforming as it is right now, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's
setback,
non-conforming
yeah.
in part because of the garage, which is actually visually, it's not, I mean, it is actually the same setback that they're proposing.
No,
for
it's
the
1 foot.
Fence is
Yeah,
1 foot from. the
Looks like it's
property
right
line.
on it in here, but that's fine. Okay.
Does anyone on the board have any questions for staff? We'll have another chance.
Good for now.
Would the applicant wish to speak? Did you fill out okay. You can, I need to swear you in. Can you please give me your name and address?
Daniel Colts, 802 Burnett Avenue.
And do you swear to tell the truth?
I do.
Okay, go ahead.
So, I mean, I think your questions are right on with what our interpretation of it, that it doesn't look very much like a fence. And it's our understanding that if the extended features, the vertical features, were 1 foot closer to the house or 1 foot away from the house, we can build that and that's fine. Like that meets with code. So it's like, well, if that was the case, would it really look any different if you took a step back? Would you notice that? That seems to be pretty much the equivalent design, although not quite, because that's why we want to build it as drawn. And if there was no hip wall, then those extended vertical structures would also be fine, but you put the little hip wall in there and then all of a sudden it's the tall things are considered part of the fence now. It didn't seem to us that even though, reading the words of the that were read earlier about what the code is, well, yeah, I see how you could get that interpretation, but it doesn't seem to make sense when you say, well, what if it was this? What if it was that? That didn't seem to us to be the intent of what those words would have been, because it doesn't really occlude the sight line. It doesn't cause a safety hazard. It doesn't really seem to cause the problems that you would expect to have, at least that I would have expected to have a fence code put in place for.
Does anyone on the board have a question for the applicant? Questions for the applicant?
I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We
I guess
can,
I have one quick question.
Sorry, can you come back?
Since I'm the one spearheading the, have you looked at a possibility of a design where I'm just going to call them trellises for lack of a better term, were placed on the inside of the fence so they were not actually attached, but they would not be a part of it? Is that a design possibility?
It is, and if we don't get permission to build this, we'll probably do some variation of it. We didn't think it looked as nice that way. It kind of takes up the space we wanted to have to put, like a picnic table and to be able to eat out there. It's just, space we didn't want to give up.
Understood. Okay. Just need a bigger yard.
Doesn't everybody though?
Doesn't work that way. Okay.
Anyone else? Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. We can now open the public hearing if any members of the audience wish to speak. We will now close the public hearing. Do we have any further questions for the board or the applicant? Do you want
So I just want to follow up on
discuss?
my inference. If they were to remove the trellis, the structures that would stick up, and they were freestanding or somehow otherwise detached, but standing on the inside, what are the limits as far as the height then? Would they be, would they consider landscaping feature then? I think yes, because we've said they need to be detached.
Yeah, probably, as long as there's not a roof component to it, or they're not close
Yeah.
enough together again to make another barrier,
It's-
then they're allowed to be full projections.
So they can be whatever height then?
Correct. The way that's worded in here, there's no height limit for a landscape accent.
So the landscape accents. So
So in effect, if they were not part of the retaining wall, but they were actually inside of it and were detached, but
well, I have a question about the full projections allowed.
Right.
So the full projections are allowed, but they don't say whether they're allowed as part of a fence or not. Or does it say anywhere that they're not allowed to be part? of
Well, the next
fence?
section says fences are allowed. So
I think it's from the definition of a fence.
by the definition of a fence, then if those landscape features are part of the fence, therefore fence, then they would
Becomes
not
a
be
fence.
allowed
Right.
unless they meet the height.
So there's a pretty consistent theme
Got
in
it.
my eyes between landscape accents, fences, and planter box, that they're all
And they're
tied to the
separate.
idea of roughly 4 to 6 feet in height is what's allowed, because that's what fences are, depending on what yard you're in. Doesn't expressly say a landscape accent can't exceed 6 feet. It's only if it is that fence level of a barrier.
Part of that
basically.
barrier fence. Yeah.
But in this case, I think it's
It's the integration.
for us, it truly is the integration. I don't know where the line is drawn once you're over 6 feet tall on how many posts and how high posts can go on 0 setbacks of property lines. So right now, it's a pretty well understood, if it's a fence on a property line, 6 feet's the top, what you get to have. If we're now saying things can be affixed to a fence and they're not subject to any height limit, then I'm into a world of what am I supposed to be regulating on property lines now? And then how densely are these posts or projections able to be affixed
Right.
to a fence before it's
So
again, we get into that whole conversation again, having to redefine.
So when you measure the height of the fence, do you measure the height of the posts at the post, or is that the actual fence that is the stratos between the cross member for the?
I believe the building official has measured it. I would say it's to the highest point of the fence. I think in the past there has been interpretations it's to the horizontal part with the cap of the fence post above not being seen to be exceeding the 6 feet. So I can't speak for the history of the building official on that, but
Right.
that's my impression. That's possibly true.
But in this case, it's being interpreted as those, because it says the vertical brick
Yeah, that's the fence. Yeah.
columns are 6'6", so even those would have to come down to 6 feet.
Yeah, if I was issuing a permit for this, we don't issue permits for fences, but if we did, I would say yes, 6 feet's where you need to be for all components
For
of
all,
the
for
fence.
everything.
Because otherwise, I'm back to how high above 6 feet can I go and
Right.
still be
Right.
okay?
Okay. Do we have any more motions?
I will entertain a motion. If anybody would.
Given that the charge before us here is not to get into the appropriateness of the standard itself or the adequacy of the standard itself, just whether or not it was interpreted correctly, I think in that point, it's pretty clear. It's been explained how it was interpreted. We can read how it was interpreted and read it ourselves, and we've talked through it. We may have opinions on different ideas of what might look nice, what might not look nice, or what we think should or shouldn't be, but that's really not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about whether or not it was interpreted correctly, and I believe that it was. Therefore, I'm going to move alternative number 1.
Based on the fact that it's a tax, I'll second it.
That was a motion by Bowers, a second by Schneider. Roll call.
Bowers,
Aye.
Patton,
Aye.
Lamar,
Aye.
Schneider.
Aye.
The motion is declared approved. Any person desiring to appeal this decision to a court of record may do so within 30 days after the filing of this decision. The next item on the agenda is a request for an appeal of 3207 Oakland, parcel number 0905425050 from a decision of the zoning enforcement officer regarding encroachment of a structure within the front yard.
Good evening. I'll go through the highlights of the report here. This is an appeal of a decision of the planning director regarding a fence in the front yard and the front yard setback. The planning director's decision is that the unroofed structure, as you see in the photos on the screen, enclosing an area is a fence as defined by section 29201 in the municipal code. As a fence, the structure is limited in height and location on the property per the standards of the zoning ordinance, and the appellant's fence exceeds the maximum height of 4 feet for fences in the front yard. The structure, as you see it there, it varies in height from 6 to 8 feet approximately. The appellant, Mr. Thompson, who lives at 3207 Oakland Street where the structure has been built, asserts that the decision of the planning director is an incorrect interpretation of the zoning ordinance and that the structure should not be classified as a fence, but instead as a landscape accent that does not have the same height and location restrictions as a fence. Just as a reminder to the board, this appeal is about the definitions and standards of the zoning ordinance. It's not property specific, in which case they're not asking for an exception or a variance from the standard of the zoning ordinance. It's all about the definitions and standards as they're written in the code. Some background on this. Staff viewed the property on August 31st of this year, and a notice of violation at 3207 Oakland Street was sent to the property owners from the planning department. And the property owners are Grant and Teresa Thompson, and that was sent out to them on September 1 of this year. The property owners responded, and they were to respond by September 15th with a plan that includes actions that would be taken and timing of those actions to bring the fence into compliance with the requirements of the Ames Municipal Code. Mr. Thompson, the appellant, contacted city staff to discuss the citation and has chosen to appeal the decision of the planning director to the zoning board of adjustment. The City of Ames zoning ordinance applies setbacks and other development regulations to all structures. In this situation. Staff determined that a structure was constructed on the property. Staff classified the structure as a fence. The fence did not meet standards for a full encroachment into the front yard setback, and the fence does not meet the allowable fence height for being in the front, for being in the front yard, which I mentioned was a maximum of 4 feet, and this varies in height from 6 to 8 feet. If the structure is determined not to be a fence and is a landscape accent, as the appellant asserts, it is still subject to fence limitations due to the design and configuration of that structure. There are some definitions that apply in this case. One is definition of a structure, which means anything constructed or erected, the use of which requires directly or indirectly a permanent location on the land. Staff has determined that the constructed object using wood materials with the permanent location on the ground does qualify as a structure. Another definition that plays into this is the definition of a fence. Fence means an unroofed barrier or unroofed enclosing structure, including retaining walls. Staff finds that the structure is a barrier or structure enclosing an area. The purpose of the vertical structure is to enclose visually and physically the garden space. This is supported by the appellant's statements in an email received from Mr. Thompson on September 2nd, 2022, this year, in which he states, given the tree cover of the neighborhood and an exceedingly strong deer presence, this is why I sought to locate the garden where I did and at the height I did. Setbacks, the ordinance requires all structures to meet setbacks based upon the applicable standard for the zoning district and the type of structure. The ordinance does provide for certain specific projections into those setbacks as listed in the zoning ordinance. At issue in this appeal is section 29.402(2), subsection 2, which gives a list of permissible projections. The projections that would apply, that the appellant used in this case as a basis for his application was the part that discusses full projections allowed. And one of those full projections allowed is about landscape accents. And it says landscape accents that include but are not limited to arbors with a coverage area no greater than 15 square feet, fountains and statuary up to 4 feet in height, and constructed ponds and waterfalls at or below finished grade and similar residential landscape accents. And then at the end, it says the design and location of accent features shall not have the effect of creating a continuous wall that does not meet fence standards. Staff asserts that the vertical structures form a fence based upon the definition of a fence, and it is not a landscape accent. If it were a landscape accent, it would still be subject to fence limitations. Staff finds that the vertical structures have the effect of creating a continuous wall that does not meet fence standards, which section 29.402(2) prohibits. Fence standards in section 29.408(2)(ci) of the municipal code identifies the applicable provisions for fences in this situation that constitute the violation. The part of 29.408(2) fences that applies in this case is 2C, which is location and height in front yard setbacks and yards. The maximum height of fences in front setbacks and front yards is 4 feet. The As I mentioned earlier, the appellant believes the planning director has incorrectly interpreted the zoning ordinance by determining the structure recently constructed in the front yard is a fence. He asserts that the structure is not a fence, but a garden trellis regulated in a different section of the code under section 29.402C as a landscape accent. Staff does not disagree that a trellis can be a landscape accent as a standalone feature, but it is when they are situated together, they are subject to fence regulations. The appellant states in the supporting information that the stipulation in the landscape accents code stating the design and location of accent features shall not have the effect of creating a continuous wall that does not meet fence standards is ambiguous, since it does not clearly indicate a well-defined threshold where a landscape accent becomes a continuous wall or fence and would be subject to those regulations. The definition of continuous as provided by the appellant, not in the code, he has in quotes, marked by uninterrupted extension in space, time, or sequence. So the appellant asserts that the trellis of this structure, as he's calling it a trellis, has two gaps or interruptions that are approximately 4 feet wide and a line along the north and south axes, as he shows in his supporting information. Staff notes that the structure is connected together across the top of those gaps, and the gap is only on two sides of the enclosure. The board must determine that there was an error in the interpretation to grant the appeal from a decision of the planning director that the unroofed enclosing structure at 3207 Oakland Street is a fence for section 29.201, definition number 74, and that the fence exceeds the maximum height allowed per section 29.408 2CI. At issue is not the appropriateness or adequacy of the standards, only if staff made an incorrect interpretation. The full projection exception language in 29.402.2C VIII was modified at the end of 2020, at which time the language originally referenced structures such as arbors. Text changes were written to clarify that certain features previously permitted to project fully into the setbacks without limitation were not appropriate within setbacks. It was at this time that the language pertaining to having the effect of creating a continuous wall that does not meet fence standards was added to address the potential abuse of the allowed landscape accent projections. Staff views the structure in its totality to enclose a defined area as a fence. It is not a standalone trellises as landscape accents. With the applicant's interpretation, it would make defining structures that enclose areas somehow distinguishable from the basic definition of a fence, which would be inconsistent with the intent of the zoning ordinance having specific regulations for fences. In the event that the structure is a landscape accent, it would be subject to the fence limitations. Although continuous is not defined in the zoning ordinance, the structure is connected together with a horizontal element that spans each 4-foot opening. The structure has the effect of being a fence, even if there were to be small gaps between components of the structure, and is subject to the landscape accent qualification of fence height standards for the front yard, regardless of what the structure is defined as. So given that, it is the recommendation of the planning director that the zoning board of adjustment approve alternative number 1, which is to find that the planning director correctly interpreted the Ames Municipal Code that the unroofed enclosing structure at 3207 Oakland Street is a fence, and that the fence exceeds the maximum height allowed for a fence in the front yard and the front yard setback. That's all I have.
Thank you. Does anyone on the board have questions for staff at the moment?
I do question. I don't know where on the location map on the lot, where is this actually located?
In terms of a setback?
Yeah, no, as far on the lot, I can't tell, like in location. or at
Between the
least-
road and the house, so on the south side, correct?
Yeah, it's about 10 feet from the sidewalk, I think.
Yeah, it's located right in here.
Because I couldn't tell from the orientation to the
It's
house.
about 10 feet from the sidewalk, as Kelly says, yeah.
So it's definitely in the front yard. It's not in the
Yeah,
side. It's not in
yeah,
the back.
yeah.
It's in the
It's
front.
not, yeah, it's not only in the front yard, it's in the front setback, which is the first 25 feet of your
Okay.
property.
You can see it in this photo here.
Okay.
And there's a sidewalk.
Confirming front yard, no issue
Yeah.
of side yard, backyard.
No,
Now,
No, front yard is the trump.
if it's backyard and we're talking, then it's 6 feet, right? Not 4 feet because
Correct.
we
So-
just had the fence discussion.
Yeah. And
Okay.
then- so just to make it more interesting, you have a yard and a setback.
Right.
So a fence anywhere in your yard, whether it's in the setback or in the front yard, I'm sorry, which is between the front of the house and the street, anywhere it's
In the
it's
setback.
4.
Okay.
It's not till you get to the house and go behind it along the side or in the rear, where you
Right.
need to go up to 6.
All right.
And that's not really what we're not trying to figure out if it's allowed or not. It's more, is it a fence or is it not a fence?
Yeah, it's
Is what
just
we're-
it's the
No, I was looking
same thing as the last
definition
one.
of
You're
what it
deciding
is.
is the definition of a fence apply.
Mhm.
If it does not, in this case, as a landscape feature, is it still subject to the fence standards of 6 feet in height?
And just to clarify too, under section 29-402,
Of 4 feet, you mean?
Correct.
right.
Yeah.
Max of
Front
4,
yard.
sorry.
Under section 29-402, planter boxes would also be under the same restriction as a fence. If they're in the front, they would be 4 feet. In the back, it would be
Right.
6.
Right. So like if you had the trellis attached to your planter box so vines can grow up,
Right.
you would have a 4-foot limit in the front and you would have
These are
6 in the back.
these are clearly planter boxes.
The bottom of it is, yes.
Yeah. The purpose of it is to plant plants, and it's a box, and it has.
We're not talking about the planter boxes, though. We're talking.
I know, but it's
about
attached to them.
it's not a, they're
In the part of it, it is. I think.
part of it, yes.
I mean, we can clarify, but it looks like it's attached to the planter boxes. But regardless, it would still be subject to the same
Right.
limitation.
Kelly, again, as you said, the question here is the appropriateness, not, or the, whether or not the interpretation was correct, not the appropriateness of the definition within the code. The appropriateness of the definition in the code is up to the city council, correct? I mean,
Yes, in this case, that I think the question is there is some discretion in interpreting this one. It's not a measurement of 6 feet. Does it have the effect of?
yeah.
So that's where I think to us, it's clearly a fence to start with. We don't have to get to the second part of the conversation, but that's your job is to sort out whether we looked at it first as a fence correctly. And then if not, have we applied that standard of a landscape accent still needing to meet fence standards appropriately? So it's a 2-part argument on this one. The first one, is it just a fence? If that's your decision, then the appeal is over.
So there's that, and then sometimes we do have variances or exceptions come before us. Sometimes there's also text amendments that go to the council. How do those vary? Or is this something that would even possibly be a request to council for a text amendment?
So anything can make its way to council as a text amendment
Okay.
request from anybody. On a rare occasion, ZBA's had letters go to the council. Obviously, the general public makes lots of requests to the council. So in terms of a variance or exception, council didn't create any any specific exception process to deal with unique types of structures when we updated these encroachment allowances. So there's no avenue to approach this from just trying to decide if it's compatible or not. We don't have that. And as a variance, which is defined under state law, our advice to the appellant was you're just not going to be able to make those findings. You can't prove a hardship on the basic use of your property. So our advice was don't file for that. He could file for that if this was not successful. It'd be very hard pressed to
Then
make
we'd be
those.
looking at all 27 or whatever it is.
You'd be looking at all those findings, and
Yep.
you have to make all of them. And the hardest one is always proving the hardship that you've taken away the economic value of the property, which with a single family home on it is going to be hard to do. So that's going to be a tough one. So in the way the code is currently structured, either it's permitted but as a structure that as an exception in the front yard, or it's not going to be there. And there's no current permit to allow it some other consideration from a compatibility perspective. Someone could ask for that type of an allowance to be created. I don't know that council would take it up. I don't know what parameters would be applied to that. That would be all a
Yeah.
discussion for another night or
Who
another
knows?
day. Yeah.
Any other questions for staff at the moment?
I have one. So if depending on what you call it, let's say if it's a fence, if it was brought down, because currently it's 6 feet or more, is that right?
4.
Or it's
Well,
over
right now
4.
it's 4 to 8 feet.
6 to 8.
I think
Or
it's
6 to 8.
I think the 6 to 8.
6 to 8.
Okay.
6 to 8.
And it can only be a max of 4 if
Correct.
it's a fence.
Okay. So if it was brought down to 4 feet, would this be okay? Is my question.
Yes.
Okay.
Anything that's 4 feet or less is basically going to be allowed in your front yard.
Okay.
And we measure, just in case it comes up, we measure height based on average grade. So there's some fluctuation here about exactly what, it's not 4 feet on an angle. It's an average of 4 feet. So there's some play there to allow for straight lines and then jogs and step downs.
Would the applicant wish to speak?
Yes, please.
Did you fill out an orange information card? You did. I need to swear you in. Can you please provide your name and your address?
Grant Thompson, 3207 Oakland Street, the appellant.
And do you swear to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
I think the case before you, the two best words to describe it are ambiguous and arbitrary in terms of how the code is being applied. So as it is, this is a trellis. A arbor is an allowed feature in the landscape accents. The point of an arbor is to grow plants up it, provide some interest. This is a trellis connected to the garden beds to grow plants up it. There's good horticultural reasons for that, which we could talk about if you're interested. The issue is if it's a trellis, that phrase that, or sentence that has been added at the end in 2020, the creating an effect of and is it continuous, just because that phrase was recently added doesn't mean it's sufficient to take care of the situation. Continuous, how big of a gap would be allowed? Or if it's a trellis, how far would that extend before it's no longer acceptable? None of that is text language in the code. That's left to the interpretation of the planning director. How are the city of residents supposed to respond to that if it's completely arbitrary and ambiguous? As we go on, if there is some sort of a potential overlap, a Venn diagram of what could be considered a trellis and what might be considered a fence, if there is overlapping gray area, again, the application of one over the other is equally arbitrary and ambiguous. Several instances in the city's position, they add additional language to clarify what they're talking about. Groupings of trellises. Nowhere in landscape features does it mention groupings. So if they're situated in a certain way, suddenly that's not allowable. That's not what the text says. If they are continuous, or if the gap is not big enough, again, where is that defined? How is one city official supposed to say a gap of X foot is okay, but not in a different situation? Even the word enclosure is included in the fence definition, but there is no concept of enclosure in the landscape accents definition. If you take it as a trellis, it's not continuous. And how would one define of having an effect? Just because that clause was added 2 years ago doesn't mean it's adequate in all situations. And I would encourage you in this case to consider that as at least being ambiguous in terms of how residents, city officials, and even yourselves have to decide on that. And in the case of a city where there is no permitting process for landscape accents and no permitting process for fences, the city is not interested in proactively having those conversations with residents. They're interested in retroactively applying that when infractions occur. Additionally, I'd like to point out in your packet, there are numerous letters from the neighborhood, 14 of them, I believe, in the Pro case. I would also point to the folks in the room. If you're supportive of this endeavor, can you raise your hands? There are 5 people sitting here in the room with us that are all also supportive of this. At the end of the day, the planning code is supposed to be standard, something that someone can point to everywhere else in the code. You give distances, you give feet, you give heights. And even the slippery slope argument, which is given, if something, if we allow this, then what? That really denies good uses. This is well within my property. It's out of sight triangles. For the public to engage with this, they actually have to be trespassing on my property. While creating my garden, I've met many neighbors in my neighborhood. They've stopped by, they've complimented it. We've gotten to know each other, hence why people are here in the room with us. Even the Ames 2040 plan has text in there such as including materials that enhance the visual appearance of properties and neighborhoods. In terms of environmental stewardship and sustainability should guide what we do in the 21st century. That's on page 47. Putting a garden in my front yard so I can reduce food miles and carbon emission, that's pretty sustainable. Community character, point C6, improved design quality. Seek to expand the use of good design features in private development as well as in city infrastructure. The goal is to create a positive investment in the aesthetics and image of the city, and not just for the sake of density. Embellishment in the surroundings to create interest and whimsy and identity, including a focus on people and the environment. This is a garden. The language that is being used to deny this is ambiguous at best, having an effect and continuous. How does one define that? And in this case, since there's no mechanism that a resident has to go through on the front end for the city to weigh in on this, they're only weighing in on the back end. And their solution is to cut it down, denying my time and material costs that went into this. So again, arbitrary and ambiguous. The language is ambiguous. It can lead to arbitrary rulings which have inconsistent outcomes. That's really not how code should be applied in a community. I'll close my comment. Questions.
Yeah, does anybody have questions for the applicant?
So I can't tell from the pictures, but as much of the structure, we'll just call it for sake of argument, attached to the planter boxes, which are inside of it.
Yes, they're connected.
So like the posts for the planter box.
The posts are the
posts for
corners of the planter boxes.
structure.
Yep. Yes.
Is that on all 4 sides of it?
There is a gap, an opening on the north and south edges, aligning with the door of the house. Even the concept of enclosure, or to the city's point, there's not gaps on the east and west. Gaps are not in the landscape accent text. That's not part of that. And if there's overlap of is it a trellis or is it a fence, it's arbitrary which one is applied.
I have a question. What was the purpose of adding these vertical
Sure.
elements?
The purpose is to hold up plants, okay? Photosynthesis, we get more verticality in our plants. We can grow more plants. It keeps airflow higher. That reduces pathogen load on leaf surfaces. It avoids splashing from the soil, which is also a pathogen transfer. The point is to hold up plants. no different than an arbor, which is explicitly allowed.
So it's for growing plants.
Yes,
Okay.
hence the planter boxes.
In our,
Oh,
in the information that was presented by the staff, there's at least a statement that I believe was attributed to you. And it's given the tree cover of the neighborhood and exceedingly strong deer presence. This is why I sought to locate the garden where I did at the height I did. Is that an accurate statement or a relatively accurate reflection of what you said?
That is a true statement.
Can you
Sure.
define kind of what you meant
Sure,
by that? Can you explain to you? You just did a great job of explaining why you
sure.
put the sides on it and stuff. Can you explain from
The
that perspective what? you
Sure.
mean?
on September 2nd, Friday before Labor Day, I received the notice from the city indicating the fence issue that the city is citing it as. In my response to the city on that day, when most folks were already out for the afternoon, including Mr. Anderson, who's issued the citation, I wrote back explaining the intent of locating it in the front yard where I have the most sunlight on my property. I have heavy shade in the back. This lot's almost 600 feet deep. I only have a little bit of sun in the front yard. Put a garden where it's sunny. In terms of the deer presence, it's a major issue in the neighborhood. If I'm going to put a vegetable garden out, it needs protection. The city also recently built a community garden with pretty significant fencing around it. Just saying the city recognizes that the deer are an issue in this community.
Any other questions for the applicant at this time? Thank you.
Thank you.
We will now open the public hearing. If any members of the audience who wish to speak in support of or in opposition to the appeal. If you can just give it to, yep. Please state your name and address.
My name is Sarah Nusser. I live at 3312 Oakland Street.
And do you swear to tell the truth?
Yes.
Thank you.
I have for all of my life dealt with, all of my professional life dealt with research regulations, and they are incredibly arcane. They can be difficult to understand, but I always understood the purpose of them. I might not agree with the approach, but I understood the purpose of them. We're either protecting human subjects or we're protecting animals. We're protecting the environment by preventing release of radioactive or hazardous materials. We're protecting our lab mates and other research partners. When I hear the discussion tonight, I don't understand what we're trying to safeguard here. This, as a neighbor, as a yard that's been completely destroyed by deer, the pressure is very significant in our neighborhood. I look at this, I see something that's really beautiful. I can't wait to see the garden that comes up from it. It's a place for us to gather around and rally around. So I'm one of the neighbors that sent Mr. Anderson a note, one of many neighbors. I watched the email stream that went through. Frankly, the neighbors are really stunned that this was called into question. I realize that we do not totally understand all the regulations that have been discussed tonight, but I really do not see the harm associated with this, outside of whether we're breaking some sort of specification about whether you can have a board connecting two sides together. And so I really want to strongly express my support for the Thompsons' structure here, that it be allowed to go forth unaltered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Did you fill out an orange information card?
I did.
Please state your name and address.
I'm Mike Peterson at 536 Forest Glen Street.
And do you swear to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
I just wanted to echo Sarah's comments there as well. We have been, we can see the structure clearly from our front porch and even from our front window of our house. And we've enjoyed very much watching the structure grow. and we believe it's a beautiful addition to the neighborhood. There's some comments in the emails. It's like, yeah, my only disappointment is that I'm never going to have that good of woodworking skills, right? So, and I did also want to echo that we have for 2 years now tried to start a garden in our backyard, and it quickly gets eaten by the deer in our neighborhood. So I do want to echo that comment as well. So I'm strongly in support of allowing them to keep the structure as currently designed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone else from the public wish to speak? Okay, I will now close the public hearing since no one else is walking towards the podium. Okay. Does anyone on the board have any further questions for staff or the applicant?
I do want to make just a quick response as the planning director. It's appealing my decision. We've said the word trellis a lot tonight. It is not in the zoning ordinance. So the perception of what a trellis is open to a lot of individual interpretation. So the only thing that's really referenced is an arbor, which was brought up. And that was clearly understood to be something that's effectively a 5x3 structure, right? 15 square feet is what it was intended to be in terms of that kind of little incidental thing that was in a yard. So as we talk about trellises, it's not something that's in the code. It's not there. It's an interpretation then of what another version of a landscape accent may be. But in terms of scale and scope, what we're looking at is an arbor, and a 5x3 is one version of a scale and scope that's appropriate. The other boundary we talk about is whether it becomes this barrier as a fence and has that sense of enclosure. And I do want to be clear that I don't want a decision tonight that says cut off that little board in between the openings. I am determining that the whole structure, with or without that 4-foot gap connecting by one board, is a barrier. It's protecting something. It is a fence. So if the direction was cut that board, I would still say it is an enclosure of an area and it's still acting as a barrier for the fence. So I want to make sure that was clear, as we're not talking about whether there's a gap or not. That was not what my decision hinged on. So I think we've heard testimony. It's in the written record as well. It is for protection purposes. It isn't just solely as a garden feature. So to me, that's where we're getting into the definition of a fence again. As I have to bring it back to the appropriateness of the regulation. If the city wanted to promote more gardening, council can do that. They could create an exception process or do something along those lines. I have to work with the standards I have in place. I don't have a standard that says gardens are exempt, protective measures around gardens are exempt. So that's why I had to classify it as a fence. And that's where I just want to kind of come back to where I was in the position of having to interpret this thing. Don't disagree that maybe good governance should require fence permits in advance. The city has not chosen to do that in the history of its zoning ordinance. So that's not a choice of mine. That's 100 years of zoning administration where fence permits have not been required in the city. So there's a lot of arguments tonight that may or may not motivate a city council to change policy, but a lot of those don't come back to what the current standards are and the current regulations are.
Does anyone have any questions for staff? If not, does the applicant have any final comments?
Yeah.
If I'm beholden as a resident of the Ames to the text that's in the city code, and that's what I have to work off of is the text on the page, having city officials with history and other ideas and all of these things that come into play that is not evident and clearly communicated to residents puts anyone wanting to do something good at a severe disadvantage. Thank you.
Okay, so our task is, if the planning director correctly interpreted the on-roof enclosing structure as a fence, and that's the first thing we need to determine.
Right, because if you find in the affirmative it's a fence, then there's no other
Then
review
that's the end.
necessary. Yep.
Okay. And the arguments are whether it's continuous or not. And in my opinion, all fences have elements of non-continuous. They have a door or they have an opening. And if I
I
would
think there's a
have,
third alternative that I'd like to propose. I think under the code, it's definitely defined as planter boxes, which are then also subject to the fencing
to the
requirements.
fencing requirement.
Right, regardless of whether it's enclosed area or not, it's planter box. And the height for a planter
Or
box.
it's a fence for a planter box. I think you can,
Right, but it is clearly a planter box. And so you can,
I don't know, you're saying it's clearly a planter box.
Well, I
City's
think-
saying it's a fence.
I think the city said it's a planter box and the applicant said it's a planter box. So these are planter
No, the
boxes.
city's saying it's a fence.
But
Mhm.
also in discussion, asking staff, these are planter boxes.
They're attached to the
They're
planter
attached
box.
to the planter
It's attached to the
boxes.
planter boxes. So
Because
under,
we have to determine whether the determination that it's a fence,
Right.
not a planter box, is correct.
And
So if
that
we
would
decide
go back
not
to,
to,
even if it was a planter box, you still
It's
get
the
back
same-
to the.
it's
That's what I'm
still a
saying, is I
fence.
think
right,
it's the
whether
same
it's a
thing.
fence
We
or
are-
a planter box.
I don't think
it's
we're
the same thing.
necessarily bound by that because we can actually say, no, that the definition, it fits the definition of a planter box. And therefore, for that reason, then it does not conform.
But
That's-
that's not what we're,
I think we can do that because we can actually say,
Got it.
no, this is actually how, actually both have gotten it wrong.
but I don't think so because
for the
it spans between planter boxes.
Right, but it's still attached to the planter boxes. Therefore, it has to conform with the fence height standard.
Correct, but that's why I would say it's not a planter box. It's a fence for the planter boxes. Because it spans
We,
between.
we viewed it as a fence around
The
the
planter
garden,
boxes.
around the planter
Right.
boxes. We did
Right.
We
but
did
I'm
not
saying
get
we're
into
getting at the
exactly,
same-
it's
it's the
I
same
know what you're
issue, but I
saying,
think-
and yeah.
But I think as far as clearly, as far as wanting a clear definition of something, it's clearly planter boxes because the posts are actually part of the planter box
So,
itself.
so following the same logic as the last item, I don't disagree with what you're saying, is because it's all connected, you can say it's all one thing,
Right.
and you still get to the same result.
The planter boxes have to conform with the fence height requirement for the front yard or the backyard. If these were in the backyard, they could be 6 feet. They're in the front yard, they have to be 4 feet.
Mhm.
That doesn't preclude him from attaching something across the top that would further prevent deer from getting into it or whatever. But either way you cut it, whether it's a fence or planter boxes, they have to conform to the fence height.
Right. But to move an alternative, any alternative, we have to say if it's a fence first, right? Is that,
I mean,
no, we don't.
I mean, you're judging the appeal that we acted incorrectly. It doesn't mean you have to agree that it's a landscape accent, I guess is what you're saying, is you could say,
Right. I'm
What
not
you
saying,
said
I'm
is
saying
it's
it's not a
neither-
landscape
it's neither.
accent, and I don't necessarily have to agree that it's a fence, but I think it's very clear to agree that it's a planter box.
so what you would effectively be doing, saying that we were incorrect and they're incorrect,
But
staff apply the right regulation outside of this room, which will get you to the same result.
well, because I think if it, for instance, if there was a single planter box that was, say, I have some in my yard that was, say 4 by 6 feet or something like that, it was a single one, but then I built a trellis, a fence, or something structure around it to protect it. Would that necessarily be a fence? No, because it's just a single one. It doesn't enclose an area, a certain area, but I'm not going to really go in and out of it.
But it is enclosing an area.
But it definitely is a planter box, and regardless, then the planter box and that structure has to conform to the fence height
I
also.
don't know, architecturally, as soon as you're going around it, whether you're going around it 2 or 3 sides, you're enclosing an area.
I think
Therefore, it
that
can
right.
be, it's a
ba-
fence, whether
basic
it's,
construction of the zoning ordinance,
Right.
it's pretty clear. Our intent
Right.
as aims is nothing over 4 feet is really substantially supposed to
Right.
be in that front
right.
yard.
And the whole purpose of this is so that there's not a, sorry,
would your motion then be to affirm the affirm the decision of the director that this structure has to conform to the fence height standards?
Yeah, based on the fact that it's a planter box. Right.
But
So,
the decision was that this has to conform to fence height
so
standards.
it's a concurrence for a different reason.
Mhm.
You understand the,
But affirmance of
Yeah.
the decision.
right. Yeah.
Would you like to make a motion?
Yeah, I can make a motion. I would move that for alternative number 2, that the planning director indirectly determined the unroofed enclosure was a fence, but that it was actually planter boxes, but then therefore then agree with the decision based on the fact that a planter box must also still be conforming to the fence height standard.
So I don't know that
I don't know that that's
is an option.
No, that's not an option because then we'd have to.
so
We have to
that's
go-
why I phrased
Mhm.
the motion the way I did. That you're affirming the decision that this
Right.
structure has to meet fence height standards.
Okay, that's
You can
it.
say that for the reasons that it's a planter box. I don't necessarily.
I mean, I
I
really,
still
I
think
really
that's
think
problematic,
you're,
but
I really think he is
I did say
declining
that.
both options here,
Yeah.
both staff's interpretation and the appellant's,
which means it goes back to the planning.
which
director.
means it goes back to administrative review.
Yep.
And it'll come back to them be calling it a planner box because we've been told it's none of the other choices.
Yeah.
I don't,
Well,
yeah,
that's
so I
part of
think
the
that's really
discussion,
what's,
if anybody
Right.
wants to chime
Right,
in.
but I don't know how it doesn't go back to you if it's if your decision is that the director's interpretation is incorrect, it goes
Yeah.
back.
It goes
Yeah, you're saying it's not a fence, which then it'll go back to them and they will come back to us and say it's a planter box.
so you, I mean, you could be clear, we didn't call it a fence because it's attached to a planter
And then
box.
it's still required, it still needs to meet the requirements of a
Right.
fence because
I think
the
it just
planter
sets
box.
Or you could
precedent.
just say it's a fence that has a planter box at the bottom of it. I mean, it's effectively the same thing.
Well, it's a different intent, though. I understand the intent because obviously it's not uncommon to have. I have my own. I don't particularly have fence around mine because I don't live in an area that has many deer. I don't think I've ever seen any, but there is actually clear code that affects planter boxes. So that's all right. I don't have to make a motion. Anybody else can make a motion too.
Does anybody want to second that motion? Otherwise, how does that, how do we reconcile?
If I don't have a second, then it doesn't go forward.
Yeah, it doesn't go
It's
forward.
just, it doesn't go forward. Okay.
So I've made my record and it can live or die.
Okay. Can we still have discussion? Or do
No,
we
without
have,
a
Not without a
second.
motion.
Not without a
Not
second.
second.
Not on that. Yeah.
not on that motion?
Just ask for the second.
Does anybody have a second? Anybody second that motion? And then that motion is denied, or does it
It
just
just
die?
dies.
Just
Okay.
fails, yeah,
It's
the
dead.
motion
Okay.
dies.
So now we can have discussion again, or
No,
do
you
we
can
have
make a,
to?
Right.
somebody needs to make a motion.
Someone has to make a
You can-
motion.
Should be, should be a discussion of a motion at this
Right.
point.
Would anybody like to propose a motion? Um,
Let's,
because of the location, aesthetic of the structure, I agree that it's hard for me to say that it's a planter box because it's a grouping of and again, we're getting into the technicalities of it, right? It's a planter box and it spans between planter boxes and there's clearly an entrance. So it's an enclosure, which makes it a fence. So because whether I think that it's whatever my personal opinions about it, it's about, is it being interpreted correctly as a fence? And due to that, I would move alternative 1. Would anybody like to second that motion?
I'll second that.
That is a motion by Amar, a second by Bowers. Do we do roll call first, or can we have a
You can
discussion?
just have it.
Can we have a discussion? Does anybody want to discuss this before we do the roll call?
I mean, I don't have any problem with defining it as an enclosure so it has the fence. My issue is just the precedent for
It being a fence.
it. Yeah, when in the relationship to planter boxes. Because if you then have a single planter box and you put a structure around it, is that necessarily a fence? But it still has to conform. So
Well,
I'm just thinking as far as ambiguity and clarity for
Mhm.
other people, precedent that it sets. It says, okay, if you have a planter box and you want to enclose it or planter boxes, it still has to be conforming to the fence. Okay, everybody can
Mhm.
understand that and live that. Obviously, in a situation like this where you have somebody that goes first, you know, they don't know. That doesn't preclude somebody from having a single, I think, arbor or trellis that fits within the conformity within that would serve that purpose.
Right, but then you're
But it-
limited to that 15
but it doesn't
square
inc-
feet.
but it doesn't enclose.
Right, and you're limited to a certain square feet.
So like if it was on one side that was there and the rest of it was 4 feet, you may say, okay, that's, you know, maybe that is the landscape feature for it. Or if it was independent on the inside and not part of the enclosure was 4 feet, but then there was a trellis on the inside.
Right, that's taller. This freestanding thing, then it's
Okay. So
I think
in
the-
part of the discussion, then would that not then be more of an arbor? If it was on the inside, not enclosing anything, and it would allow the plants to grow up it.
I'm not sure I'm completely
Well, you're-
following.
So the exterior would be 4 feet as far as the fencing would be concerned, but then on the inside, if there were structures that,
They were detached from the fence component and
Yeah,
they're
and
standalone little
supported the-
arches for growing. I mean, I would have to allow for that because they're not connected to the fence. They're not in and of themselves enclosing an area. They are exactly what a landscape accent would be. It's that enclosure, that barrier. That's the
right.
part
And
that-
I asked
yeah.
those kind of questions for a purpose.
right. And you're not allowed to have unlimited amounts of them. So you're limited to the 15 square feet if you have an arbor.
For one, but then you could have more than one.
Yeah, it does not.
Oh, it does
There's
not.
no limit.
There's no
Not-
limit to
That's
them.
why there's
Oh.
there's no limit to the
I was-
arbor.
So they could
I
be on
was-
the inside as
You
long as
couldn't
they're not
stack them
enclosed.
So
in a
you can
row
have
to
as
make
many
a
as
wall,
you'd
though,
like.
right? Like that's
Right, that's an
why that was
enclosure
added.
and making a wall. But I understand, but if there were separate, like 4 of them on the inside,
That is
that would
true.
allow for plants to
That
grow
is
up in
allowed.
it. Sorry, I'm a problem solver too much sometimes.
No, I.
So I'm just clarifying.
I
That's
think-
why I said I could go with the. My goal was to make it clear that even regardless if it's a planter box, that the fence height requirement still applies.
Right.
Okay, I think I've made the record on that. So then I don't.
Um,
If there's not any more discussion, then
there's any more? Yeah, if there's no more discussion, we can do a roll call.
aye.
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 The motion is declared approved. Any person desiring to appeal this decision to a court of record may do so within 30 days after the filing of this decision. I will take a motion to adjourn.
I'll move to adjourn.
I will second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. We are adjourned. Thank you.